So as we introduce our speakers tonight, I'd like to note that the title for our discussion is A Shared Struggle, pointing to the reality that all faith traditions face the problem of sexual abuse. Our goal tonight is to learn from each other and share concrete ideas to make all religious spaces safer. So our panelists tonight include Dr. Guila Benchimol, who is a member of the Orthodox Jewish community in Toronto, Canada. She is Senior Advisor on Research and Learning for SRE Network. Those initials stand for Safety, Respect, and Equity. Thank you for being here, Guila. We're also joined by Maureen Garcia, who is based in New York, who is Lead Safeguarding Specialist for GRACE, or Godly Response to Abuse in the Christian Environment. It's a national organization that was founded by people in the Protestant community. We look forward to learning from you, Maureen. Thank you. I'm also pleased to introduce Nadiah Mohajir. She is the co-founder and co-executive director of Heart, Women and Girls, which works in the Islamic community in Chicago. We are honored to have you with us tonight, Nadiah. Our conversation will be led by Sara Larson, the executive director of Awake, who spends much of her time accompanying victim survivors of abuse in our survivor circles. And so I'll turn to you, Sara, to start our conversation.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you to all of our panelists for being here. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I know that I have a lot to learn, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your wisdom. So what we've experienced in the Awake community is that everyone comes to this work kind of with their own story on their own journey. And so I'm wondering if you could share with us, each of you, what led to you getting involved with this work addressing sexual abuse in your faith community? And then what does your job currently involve now? So if we could get started with that, Guila, would you be, or Maureen, why don't you go first?
Sure. Thank you for having me here. I'm very happy to be here. So a number of years ago, when I was very young, in my early 20s, I had gotten married. And then after about 10 years of being married, a 12-year-old came to me. She was a relative and disclosed that my then husband had been sexually abusing her for about 3 years. And so I had never dealt with this before. I wasn't sure what to do. But I told a couple of friends, and I talked to one of the pastors at my church, and he knew what to do. He knew what to do to help me through the shock and confusion. He knew what to do legally, what we were obligated to do. He knew what to do. He knew what to do. And then about a year later, another man I was a family friend, was also very instrumental in my spiritual formation. He was also, somebody turned him in as a serial child sexual abuser. And so, this was right around the time that the Gaslight expose was coming out. And so there was a lot of sexual abuse in discussion, or at least starting to have discussions around it, at least in Catholic circles. Anyway, so I started to research everything I could about abuse from every angle I could, because I didn't ever want to be in a situation where I didn't see the signs, I didn't see the red flags, where I couldn't protect a child. And so, 20 years later, I started working for GRACE last year, and I was writing and speaking about sexual abuse in Christian communities before that, specifically Protestant Christian communities. And for GRACE, what I do is I'm the lead safeguarding specialist. So I'm involved in training leaders in churches or Christian communities, training all the adults in Christian communities about sexual abuse. How do you recognize it? How do you prevent it? How do you create a culture that's safe for the vulnerable, but that's not welcoming for people who would be predatory or seeking to abuse someone? What does it look like to hold an abuser accountable? So we kind of do trainings on that. We also do a lot of work with policies, helping churches to have some kind of guidelines in place that are victim-centric and trauma-informed, not legal and for litigation purposes, more for the victims and how do you prevent, again, how do you respond, how do you care for victims, survivors in your community after the fact. So we help create policies, and we help walk churches and organizations through that process. Like, what are the questions you need to be asking? What are the resources and the limits that you have within your community? And how can you best utilize your resources to create the safest place possible? And then the other thing that I do at Grace is every week we get multiple requests for consultations. So church leaders or church members or people who are victims will contact us, and we'll have either formal or informal consultations where we help them process through their experiences or the questions that they have or their options for what they need to do next, or what are the best ways to move forward in your community or lead your community this way. And for victims, a lot of it is just affirming to them that, yes, you're interpreting reality correctly. This is, that was abuse. There is devastating impact. And what would you like to do with that now? And how can we help you? What kind of questions do you want to look at? So that's basically what I do daily.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Maureen. And I have to say, I've been following Grace's work for quite a while and just so much admire the things that you're doing. I actually watch a lot of your webinars, so I really appreciate the work of Grace. So thanks for being here. Should we go to you next, Guila?
Sure. Thank you so much. And I'm really honored to be here with you all. And thank you, everybody, for taking time tonight to come. So my name is Guila. I live in Toronto, and I sort of fell into this work in a roundabout way. I was actually a Jewish educator for over 10 years in my community, and also outside of the Orthodox community, but still in Jewish spaces. I was both a formal and an informal educator in schools, in camps, and in youth groups. And I had nothing to do with the world of abuse other than being a safe person that people sometimes disclose to. And so whether that was students or families or just people that trusted me as an educator, I knew these stories. And at the age of 29, I decided, okay, I need to go to school. I need to do something to show my child that there is a different path in the community where I come from. Not everybody, not every girl goes to university. So that was like a big challenge. So at 29, I started university. And I thought I was, still going to practice in my faith community, but I was done being a Jewish professional. That's like the term in our field. And I started studying criminology, which was really a different kind of career for a young Orthodox woman. And when I started studying criminology, I started opening my eyes to different ways that we can solve some of our social problems. And I started to look at the issue of abuse through the lens of a crime, not just a social problem or a mental health issue. And for example, my first criminology class where we learned about restorative justice, I said, wow, these indigenous roots remind me of our Jewish faith tradition. Why don't we use restorative justice to solve some of our social issues? And I sort of put that aside. Fast forward a few years later, right before I was to begin my master's career, an Orthodox Jewish boy was murdered by an Orthodox Jewish man in New York, which was a very rare crime. And I started to notice that the way the community was talking about this crime was different than the way it was in the news. And the community started talking about the crime, saying he must have been sexually abused. That's why the man killed him. And it wasn't a topic that we usually talk about publicly or on websites. So I studied that case for 2 full years as my master's topic to look at what it allowed the community to talk about and how we were going to go about solving social problems. Were we agreed upon that we should go to the rabbis, or do we actually think we should go to the police? Or what was the debate over there, for example? And I started getting calls from rabbinical students, so people in seminary, saying, we never want our name in the headline. Not only do we never want to do something wrong, but we never want to appear as if we're doing something wrong. Our seminaries won't teach us this material. Can you come and train us? Things have changed, which we'll talk about later. Seminaries now do offer these kinds of courses, but at that time, that wasn't the case. It was 2011. And so I started doing trainings like that. I got my doctorate, and I started doing more and more work outside of the Orthodox community, where there was a bit more willingness to talk about sexual violence in a wider frame. So looking at adult victimization, looking at the victimization of women in addition to men and others. So that's how I got into this career. And in terms of what I do, so I do a couple of things at the Safety, Respect, Equity Network, which is an umbrella organization of 160 Jewish organizations across the United States. I work on literally those three-legged stools: safety, respect, and equity, because we believe that they are intertwined. I do a lot of similar work to Maureen. I do consultations, I do policies, I do training, I create resources and things like that. I also run a restorative justice practice with my colleague, Dr. Alyssa Ackerman, for Jewish survivors that want it, who want to hold accountable Jewish institutions that have wronged them through sexual harm. And I also sit with a panel of rabbis that their job is to investigate other rabbis that they get complaints about. And so I add that lens for them to understand, how do you approach the victim? How do you approach the rabbi that is perhaps did something wrong here? How do you approach the entire case? So that's just a little bit of what I do. And I do this in different denominations in the Jewish community, because there's no one community. It's a very, very wide with different branches.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Guila. And I didn't tell you this before, but actually your voice was kind of the inspiration for this event. I and some others heard a talk that you gave in another context, and we said we need to figure out a way to have this person speaking with our organization. So thank you for inspiring us and for all the work that you do. And Nadiah, I'm so glad to have you here. I'd love to hear a little bit of your story and what you do.
Yes, thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here among such esteemed panelists. So I, got into this work it's like been a lifelong commitment, really. I've been sort of in the work of sexual health promotion and gender-based violence prevention since high school. I started volunteering at the local shelter and things like that. And then when I went into college and grad school and started studying public health, I became particularly interested in health disparities and why certain communities had a harder time accessing critical health and social services than others. And so when I was working as a consultant for the Department of Health and Human Services, my supervisor at the time invited me and a colleague to plan some sort of health education campaign or program that was reaching Muslim communities. And so, we convened a group of stakeholders in Chicago, and we basically said, what would this look like? What should we do? And so ultimately we planned a health and wellness day for mothers and daughters. And, sometimes they were together, sometimes they were in age appropriate workshops, but we talked about all the things, like puberty, sex ed, peer pressure, sexual assault, sexual abuse, consent, all of these really big hot topics. And I kind of was ready to move on to the next project. And then everyone who came stopped me and said, when are we going to do it again? When are we going to do this again? This was amazing. The first time we've been able to have a safe space and talk about all these issues that, we've not had a space to talk about. And so that kind of planted the seeds for the organization that I founded called Heart in 2010. And the first couple of years of the org was really trial and error to see what would sort of stick and what wouldn't, what people were interested in. We did a lot of needs assessments, and really it was like the two big topics that everyone wanted to talk about, regardless of where they came from in the country, what culture they came from, what school of thought that they followed in Islam. Everyone wanted to talk about sexual health and sexual violence. And the minute that, we set a safe space with confidentiality, the number of stories that would come forward about, well, this happened to me and this happened to me, and this is how religion was misused, and this is how, I was not welcome anymore, and, and things like that. It really just kind of further strengthened our commitment to making this our mission. And so as I mentioned, as was mentioned, Aaron mentioned that I'm the co-founder and one of the co-executive directors at HEART, and it's actually a national nonprofit that works to promote sexual health and sexual violence prevention in Muslim communities. And what we do is actually in our acronym. So HEART is actually an acronym for Health Education, Advocacy, Research, and Training. So first and foremost, we work to raise awareness about sexual health and violence. We provide, case management and advocacy for survivors who are looking for additional information, resources, and services that they might need. We have also a financial assistance program to help survivors, retain lawyers or, pay for emergency housing and whatever else that they need. We also do research to understand the unique needs of Muslim survivors. As you may know, Muslims are the most diverse in every single way religious minority in the United States and Canada. And so it's really important to understand how their needs, are the same across culture, but also differ across communities and cultures. And so in order for us to create programming that is like specifically tailored to the needs of the folks that we're trying to reach. And then we also do training. So we work with institutions, leaders, mainstream and Muslim leaders to really deepen their understanding of how to meet the unique needs of Muslim survivors. And so, this three-pronged or this ecological approach is really looking at both how do we impact folks at the individual level and empower them to have the information they need to make informed decisions about their body and safety, but also at the systemic level where we're changing institutional policies and changing the ways in which institutions and other structural entities are thinking about the culture that can either perpetuate violence or prevent violence. And so that's sort of the work that we do at HEART. And the last thing I just want to mention is we just wrote a book. It was released in August and it's called The Sex Talk, A Muslim's Guide to Healthy Sex and Relationships. And so it has a whole, we spend a lot of time on talking about consent and different types of violence and how to seek help and, how to identify red flags in your relationship and things like that.
Wow. That is amazing, Nadiah. Thank you for sharing all of that. And I'm just really in awe of all three of you, especially, myself personally and Awake as an organization. We're very new to this and we've only existed for less than 4 years and, we're still learning. And I'm just so grateful for the wisdom and of all of you who have been doing this much longer than all of us. So thank you for those introductions. I want to start, our next question by saying, so if I were to tell the story of sexual abuse and the sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church in the United States, I would probably pinpoint the year 2002, which is when the Boston Globe stories made this problem front page news, the spotlight years. And that's when the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops started to take some steps to protect children and young people in a more focused way. And then I would probably also mention the summer of 2018 when the Pennsylvania grand jury report came out and the news and revelations about former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick became public. And so for me, that actually 2018 was the turning point in my understanding of this issue. So for many Catholics, we're kind of aware of those key moments in our process of coming to greater awareness and understanding of this issue of abuse and cover up in our church. So that's the story that I'm familiar with in the Catholic context, but many in our audience might be unfamiliar with what the history of this issue has been in other faith traditions. So I'm wondering, what story would you tell about the history of awareness of sexual abuse in your faith community and how that's changed and grown over time? Maybe Guila, would you want to go first there?
Sure. I want to be careful not to misrepresent or glom together different denominations. that have really different takes and different approaches, even different practices. Even if we believe in the same Torah, it is interpreted differently by those different groups. And so, as opposed to saying that there's a particular year to the story, I would say that there are particular flashpoints for the different denominations. And for some, the flashpoints are cases or very public scandals and perpetrators. And for others, the flashpoints are cultural moments that happened in the wider world that the Jewish community then took in. So for example, when this iteration of Tarana Burke's Me Too, right, because Tarana Burke had created it in 2006 for Black and brown girls, but then it was publicized in 2017 in this viral kind of a way. When that happened, the more progressive parts of the Jewish community, I would say, became more aware that there is a problem that is not just about children, but also includes child abuse, but that sexual abuse can happen to adults and it can happen to women, and that it includes sexual harassment, and that intertwined with that, there are issues of discrimination and inequity that are linked to instances of victimization. And so that was a really, really important moment for that part of the Jewish community to have deep conversations and a new understanding. The reason I feel confident in saying that is because I was in a Jewish fellowship a few years prior to that, and somebody said to me, I heard that you're studying this thing. It's really cool, but like, does anybody care about violence in the Jewish community? And do you really think it's a big deal? Fast forward to 2017, I saw that person and he goes to me, how did you know? And I said, well, I didn't have a secret, right? But I knew my own stories. I knew the stories of others, and I knew what I was studying was real. So that's, you know, in this particular community, the reform movement, for example, because of this flashpoint, actually 3 different parts of the reform movement did public investigations into abuses and harm in their movement, and they publicized the investigation a year and a half ago and are now working on the response. So there has been real movement there. In the Orthodox community, I would say the framing is more around childhood sexual abuse. It's much harder there to talk about adult victimization or that it happens and how it happens. And there are some very famous cases that have happened over the year. I want to name that I stand on the shoulders of people that have done this work before me. I hope that I am adding to their work, but I am not the only or the first by far. And last year was a very, very difficult moment where a beloved Orthodox author, this man's book was in every single Orthodox family's home. He received the prize from the safeguarding community in Israel, was found to be a horrible molester in the community. And so that opened up a massive conversation in the Orthodox community. It didn't just happen last year, but last year was a pivotal moment. So that's just a little bit of the story. It's different than what you were saying, Sarah, in your community.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for outlining that for us and helping us to remember that there's diversity and different communities that we have to pay attention to there. Nadiah, would you like to comment next?
Yeah, thanks. And I really resonate a lot with how Guila kind of presented it, because I was thinking about something similar. I don't want to pinpoint any particular year either. I mean, you know, Muslims have been in this country since the days of enslavement. And, you know, we know that sexual violence, you know, transcends all cultures and religions, and it, you know, it's impacted people since the beginning of time. And, you know, even if you look at Islamic tradition and the texts, you'll see that, you know, back, you know, dating centuries ago, there was scholarship that was being produced on how to address violence, how to stand up for violence, how to support victims of rape, and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So, you know, there's been kind of a dialogue that has happened, you know, for a very long time that has really been grounded in strong values of justice and protecting the vulnerable and showing compassion and you know, things like that. What I also want to echo what Guila said was, you know, again, like Black and brown Muslim women have been doing this work in this country in particular for decades. There have been so many culturally specific and religiously specific, shelters and social services that are popping up in local communities in this country and in Canada. And so, I can tell a little bit of the history of like Heart's work and, some of the how it relates to the Me Too movement as well. To Guila's point, we all know that Tarana Burke founded the Me Too movement, and then it went viral in 2017 with the Weinstein case. Around that same time in 2014, our organization was working. We received a disclosure from a local imam, or from a survivor of a local imam here in Chicago. And it kind of resulted in this cascade of events. We didn't really know what we were signing up for. We started advocating for the survivor and started supporting her and kind of connecting her to different services that she needed. And before we knew it, within like 48 hours, we got dozens and dozens of more disclosures, and we got of the same, imam. And, as we started mapping what happened in that case, we were seeing this particular case dating back to the 80s. So kind of similar to, what you're pointing out with the church, like this particular imam had, victims dating back to the 80s from when he first came to the States. And so, it launched a legal investigation, a civil investigation, all the things happened. The media was on it, and the New York Times is ultimately what broke the story, which is why the conversation suddenly became national. And so, yes, this work was happening in local communities, and there were, these rumors and buzzwords and all of that, happening in local communities, but it was never reaching like really national news. And then this story kind of made it national news. Shortly after that, there was another prominent Muslim scholar, male scholar, from a different part of the region who also was exposed for his sexual harassment and misconduct and spiritual abuse of the young women that were in his teaching circle. And so I think, all of that kind of led to a cascading of events where people were angry. There were, calls to action to like boycott these religious leaders and to stop listening to their lectures and to stop, inviting them for keynotes and things like that. And there were, other mosques that were like wanting and other communities wanting to, start taking a proactive kind of action against all of this. But I think that's what kind of elevated the combination of the Me Too. And then, there were some folks that also came in and talked about, I think there were some Muslims who wrote about mosque Me Too or something, like they kind of like, specifically focused on like what was happening in mosques. And so that kind of elevated the conversation. And even before Me Too started, there was another initiative by a colleague of mine called Side Entrance, where she was documenting the gender inequities that were happening in mosques themselves. And the ways in which she was documenting that was showing like, here's the wonderful, beautiful, clean, large, spacious space that men get versus this is where women get to pray. And that kind of started the conversation of like, how are even our religious and spiritual spaces creating conditions that become ripe for mistreatment of folks that are marginalized.
Thank you. It's really fascinating. I know very little about what you're describing, this history that you're telling, and I really appreciate it. Maureen, what would you like to share from your perspective?
Sure. Well, I would go back to kind of where you started. In the early 2000s, you have the Globe Spotlight team who does this expose on Catholic churches, specifically in the Boston area. And it's not just that there was abuse happening, but that there were cover-ups about the abuse. And so that, of course, rocked the community. The evangelical, and again, I want to highlight, like Nadiah and Guila said, there's lots of different denominations of evangelical. However, there are sort of mainstream teachings that kind of go through each of the different denominations. So there's a lot in common, even if we have different interpretations and traditions, within our denomination. Anyway, so what happened was Protestants started to respond to the Catholic problem, because people would say, well, if the Catholics have this problem, maybe you guys have this problem too. And victims and advocates came forward and said, well, of course they do. And Protestants said, well, no, that's a Catholic problem. And then when they were asked why, they came up with all kinds of reasons that actually have nothing to do with why abuse takes root or happens or is covered up in a community. And a lot of them were like kind of spiritual things. Well, their theology is wrong. They're in error. And so, of course, but we have the right theology, so that won't happen in our community. And then what happened after that was, again, like Guila said, there were a number of like flashpoints and different things that occurred, but people kind of didn't think about it. A number of victims, survivors wouldn't talk about it because it wasn't safe to in the community. But there were advocates and some victim survivors that would not be silent and kept kind of speaking, but you didn't really know about them or hear about them in any kind of mainstream environment. And then, of course, you have 2017, and you have the Me Too movement, which, like Nadiah said, with the whole mosque too, there was a corresponding church too movement that happened. And what started happening was, males and females started coming forward and saying, this has happened. This also happened to me in my church. And so that kind of brought it out into the open. People were talking about it more. And then you have, like in about 2018, you have the Dr. Larry Nassar case, who, he was the Michigan U doctor that worked with Olympic gymnasts, and Rachel Denhollander, who is a Christian and a lawyer, is the one who took him to court for her experiences of abuse that he perpetrated upon her. And so now you have a Christian with a platform who's very well respected, talking about this openly. And one of the things she talked about was, when I put people like this in jail and they're not Christians, I get tons of support from my Christian communities. But when I turn on someone, when I'm like focused on someone who's an abuser in the church, then I get attacked and there's no support there. So she pointed out that kind of, discrepancy there. And then soon after that, in 2019, you had the Houston Chronicle did something similar to the Spotlight team for Globe, where they came out and they did an expose on about 35 Southern Baptist Convention youth pastors who had abused a bunch of youth that were their students. And this revealed that or similar to how the Catholic Church had a problem, the evangelicals, specifically Southern Baptists, had a problem as well. And the problem was, again, twofold, that the abuse is happening, and in response to the abuse, there's cover-ups. And so the victims and survivors are left with no support, not being believed, lots of, they're being wounded again and again and again. So that's kind of how it all kind of started to come out into the open. And you can still see there's a lot of tension now, a number of years later. The conversations are happening, and there's lots of documentaries coming out about different fallen pastors or abusive leaders. But the conversation is at least out there now. And so more people are becoming aware of it in Protestant communities, and more people are becoming proactive or to prevent and respond to abuse, or becoming interested in, doing better in a reactive sense. They're aware of something happened in their community, and they've seen, that either people don't know how to handle it well, or that there was a lot of damage 20, 30, 40 years ago that people are still struggling with. And so they reactively are like, okay, how do we now move forward?
Yeah, thanks, Maureen. It's really interesting as you're all sharing the similarities between these stories in our various religious traditions, and also the things that are unique about them. So thank you for highlighting those things for us. I just want to mention to the audience here that if you have questions, you're welcome to submit them at this point. Now that you've heard a little bit more from these folks, might have an idea of things you might want to ask them to speak to. You can send those to Catherine questions in the chat. So now we're going to move on to a question that digs a little bit into theology and spirituality and structures in our various traditions. And this is actually a question that was sent by Christian, who's in our audience today, on his registration form, and we thought it was really valuable. So I'm just wondering if, and I'll kind of step out of the way here and stop directing who to speak first. Wondering if someone wants to share with us ways that the particular theology and spirituality or the structures within your faith tradition are either helpful in addressing abuse or hurtful in addressing abuse. And, you know, how do you see that playing out in your own religious tradition? Who would like to take that first?
I can go. Yeah, so this is a great question. You know, obviously the parallel in all of our faith traditions is that there is harmful and healing in the faith traditions, and it just depends on, unfortunately, what community you're part of and, you know, your personal lived experience. But what I'll say is some of the things that I've seen that are harmful are the misuse of tradition and texts to justify abuse, to justify and pressure people to stay silent and to protect perpetrators. So this is like, for example, either taking okay, so here a quick 101 on Islam and law and all of that stuff, right? Like in interpretation of Islamic tradition from texts like the Quran or Hadith, it really is dependent on who is doing it and what their social context is and all of that stuff, right? And so you can find in any one particular issue that you're dealing with, you will find the most conservative, not gender equitable, like sort of interpretation. And then you'll also find like the, you know, on the opposite spectrum and everything in between, right? And so knowing that that exists, there are people who ascribe to the more conservative or patriarchal interpretations of some of these things. There's also people, and so that may be used to justify abuse. There's also people who might actually take things out of context. So for example, there's a thing in Islamic law that says you need 4 witnesses, like physical eyewitnesses, to prove that premarital sex has happened, right? That fornication has happened. And so a lot of times these folks who are trying to protect perpetrators when they're accused of sexual assault, they will bring this in and they'll say, well, where are your 4 witnesses, right? Except that's conflating the spirit of that law. The spirit of that law is actually, it's really wise. It's actually to protect like consensual sex that happens outside of marriage. It's actually to protect that from coming into public, right? Because how often are there 4 eyewitnesses to something like that? Almost never, right? So it's actually to protect people and to keep their transgressions between them and God, right? And now they're saying, well, no, but where are your 4 witnesses? And if you actually look at the law, you don't require 4 witnesses to prove rape. And so it's oftentimes people taking those out of context to protect the people who are being accused of something like that. So that's number one. I've also seen harmful, structurally, I've seen that structurally our communities, and this is why we work so much at the systems level, our communities don't have adequate trained first responders. And so you'll have imams and chaplains and, you know, Islamic school principals and all of that will get disclosures and will just re-traumatize the survivor further by either not believing them or blaming them or pressuring them to stay quiet and things like that. We don't have safe policies in our institutions to report. We don't even have a process. Sometimes, you know, teachers in Islamic schools don't even know that they're mandated reporters, right? And we all know that people of color have a very complicated relationship to begin with the state, right? So, you know, calling Child Protective Services or calling the police adds its own layer of complications. And so structurally, there's also, you know, those challenges. And then finally, there's not very diverse leadership structures. So I mentioned that we have a diversity of opinion when it comes to any one issue in Islam, the dominant issues or the dominant interpretations that end up becoming mainstream are generally the ones that are interpreted by cis heterosexual men, right? And so oftentimes that leaves out women, that leaves out, other marginalized communities, and that results in not having diverse leadership, and it results in people thinking that there's only one way of being Muslim, and therefore not having access to some of the more gender equitable interpretations of these issues, and knowing that they have rights and knowing that they can speak up, and that this behavior is in fact fundamentally in conflict with Islam, right? And then in terms of being healing, this is some of the work that we've been doing at Heart, and also a lot of our colleagues in academia that are Muslim women scholars and feminist scholars, where they're reclaiming core Islamic values such as rahma, which is compassion, and adala, which is justice, and also telling stories of the Prophet and his companions to show and prove that standing with survivors and speaking up against abuse is not like, pushing back on the narrative, like this is just Western feminism talking, right? Like pushing back of that and saying, actually, it's inherently Islamic and it's in our tradition and our history to do this work. So that, the work that's been led by Muslim women, both in academia and grassroots organizations, has really been healing for folks to be able to sort of reclaim their community, reclaim their faith that they find so beloved to them, and but has also caused them harm because it's been misused. And then I want to also name the rise of what we like to call third spaces. So a lot of times the mosque setting and religious spiritual centers, they're not that inclusive, they're not that safe, they're not that gender equitable. And so there's this rise of third spaces, which is like community spaces, or like informal or even formal, like communities of Muslims that, for some reason do not feel welcome at the mosque or their mainstream Muslim community. And so, they are sort of building a community that is more inclusive and, of the diversity of lived experiences of Muslims. And I think third spaces have been doing a lot also to serve the needs of Muslims that have been marginalized, Muslims that have been harmed, and really create that sense of belonging for them.
I could jump in. Thanks, Nadiah. So I love how Nadiah talked about like the different ways that text can be interpreted, because when I do trainings to religious leaders, especially Jewish leaders, I'll put up the Jewish values that I know they believe in. I'll also look at their website and say, these are the values on your website. And then I'll say, you can't play the lottery with Jewish values. And so you either believe in them or you don't. And I think it's really important as people of faith to not act like sexual abuse is separate from, or having safe communities is separate from our faith. I think it's part of our moral obligation to our faith. It's not like there's the Judaism or whatever group you're from, and then there's having safe and not being, not being abusive. I think that's part of being a person of faith or being a community of faith. One particular Jewish term that often comes up when we're talking about abuse is lashon hara, which literally translates to evil tongue, but it means gossip. So people say, if I report, I am committing lashon hara, right? I am speaking gossip, and we're not allowed to do that. And then I point to them, well, it also says that when you witness harm, you need to rebuke the harm doer. You may not stand idly by. And lashon hara, gossiping, does not apply to this. First is always to save the life. You're even allowed to break the Sabbath to save the life, for example. So that's one specific text that can be used to harm. One of my greatest pleasures, because I am a Jewish educator first and a criminologist second, is I have now been invited to reteach some of the textual stories. So I have recently created a new teaching of the story of Esther, where we celebrate Purim, and I teach the story of Esther through the lens of women survivors. And I teach the story of Dinah in the Bible, who was raped by Shechem, through the eyes of a survivor watching the male bystanders respond to her crime without asking for her advice. And so what I also think is troubling is I'm so glad our faith teachers are teaching text with a new lens, but they need to bring in the expertise from the outside. The texts are not enough. And in the Jewish community, and Nadiah and I have spoken about this in the past where we've collaborated, we'll say, you know, I don't know if the right person is, if they're culturally sensitive, it has to be someone Jewish. No, there are so many experts out there. These wonderful people on this call with me. I'm so happy to learn from you and grateful to learn from you. I would love to bring you in to teach my community, right? We cannot be afraid. I can't be afraid that if I talk about what goes on in my community, there's going to be anti-Semitism because of that. I can't be afraid of the shame. I have to say, I can hold the beauty of Judaism, and I can also hold the reality that we got some things that we got to change. So those are some examples of theology pieces. In terms of the structure, we don't have like one grand rabbi to report to. So that's a problem because it's decentralized completely and everyone has their own way. And who's to say that their way is actually trauma-informed, survivor-centered, or even rooted in expertise? And secondly, men are very much in charge, for sure, in the Orthodox community, but even outside of the Orthodox community. So oftentimes men don't know the experiences of women and others who may be marginalized, or even other men who have been victimized. They cannot relate. So that's a structural issue, I think, in our community. Maureen, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, similar stuff again. So Nadiah, you're talking about you need 4 witnesses, and your understanding of that language is that this was an act of compassion, you know, these 4, right? But it's being twisted and used in another way. And we have within our Protestant traditions a whole bunch of verses from both the Hebrew Bible / Old Testament and the New Testament that happens with. One in particular is there's a place in Matthew 18 that if you have a problem with your brother, you go to them personally and you confront them and then you rebuke them. And if they don't respond, then you bring in other people, leaders or whatever. And, you know, this is often misapplied to victims of abuse. Well, you need to go to your abuser privately. And that is, well, first, it's obviously not trauma informed or victim centric, but it's a very, very common response, too common. And the original intent of that text was never victim and abuse. It has nothing to do with abuse. It's more peer level, you know, interpersonal kind of issues, not abuse issues. So that's like one kind of thing. Another thing that we have difficulty with is this really kind of shallow understanding of what rebuke and repentance is. And what happens is, you know, either an offender will self-disclose and confess that they are an offender, or that they've been convicted of a, you know, that now they're on the sex registry, or that they're struggling with having abused people, or someone will come and disclose that they've been abused by somebody within the church community or the congregation or the organization. And people tend to think that repentance is an event that, you know, the perpetrator, you know, cries, gets upset, feels shame and guilt, and then commits to doing better in whatever way, you know, they decide as a community, and then assumes that that person is now a safe person. But like Guila said, we need outside experts and the outside experts and some within our Christian culture and Jewish culture and Muslim cultures will agree that, you know, this is not a problem that can be fixed simply. Sexual abusers have a whole host of issues, grandiose entitlement, a whole bunch of stuff, justifications, cognitive distortions, all these things that allow them to abuse. And so what happens is they remain part of the community and they interrupt the cycle of accountability. And that's what that kind of shallow repentance does. Instead of caring for the victim and holding the abuser accountable, which, if you want to love an abuser, the absolute best way to love an abuser is to hold them accountable, because that's what they need. That's the only way that they're going to stop destroying and harming others, and in the same way, destroying their own self and their own soul. So we have to hold them accountable. It's not in tension with mercy and compassion. That's how you show mercy and compassion and love to an abuser. And it's totally, in line with how you would also show love and mercy and compassion to a victim, that you hold their abuser accountable. But we have these traditions that get taken and twisted and interrupt accountability and cause people to have more support for the abusers than for the victims. Protestantism has the same issue that Nadiah was talking about. We don't have a pope. We don't have a main pastor or anybody. We do have a lot of celebrity pastors. That's a whole other issue and problem. But we don't, it's all these different independent kind of networks. And we do have denominations, and some of them do have kind of hierarchies, but a lot of the churches don't have that kind of hierarchy. So, and on one way, that's a good thing, because if you do have a structure where the upper levels of the hierarchy are abusive, you're stuck with that. But, if everybody can kind of decide as a network loosely what they agree on and how they're going to live out those traditions, you have room to then integrate training and integrate instruction and begin to create safe cultures and communities. So there's good and bad to having a structure and not having a structure. So those are some of our issues.
Thank you. I don't know if you guys can see, but I'm just nodding along with so much of what you're saying, because so much of it sounds very familiar to me in the Catholic context, especially that misuse of religious texts and of spiritual concepts to enable abuse. So thank you for commenting on all those things. I know that all of you have worked in faith communities in the aftermath of abuse. And so I'm wondering if you could briefly share maybe an example of a faith community that has taken really positive steps in the aftermath of abuse, and describe specifically what they did. I ask partly because I, as a Catholic, have struggled to find those examples in my faith communities. And, I would really appreciate hearing what you look at and point to as, positive examples.
I really love that question. Thank you for bringing it up, Sarah. And I love it because this is something I always preach about to people who bring me in to do training, or who I see doing wonderful things in the aftermath of abuse. I say, share this with others. Tell people what you're doing. You're doing such a good job. I know it didn't come from the best place because it came in the aftermath of abuse, but that's okay for us to face reality, right? How will we know the positive stories? The New York Times, etc., write about the negative stories. Everyone on this call can tell you a negative story about abuse or how abuse was handled poorly. But if we don't start sharing the positive stories, we're not going to have the good examples. And over again, people say, no, we don't want to share because then we have to talk about the bad, or we don't want people to think that we're tooting our own horn or anything like that. So I encourage everyone on this call to leave here and share the good examples, because that's the only way we're going to create change in the world. So I have 3 quick ones. One is, and this is all public information, so I'm not talking about anything I can't share. I just want to name that. In the aftermath of an arrest of a historical case in an elementary school where I'm from in Toronto, it was a K-8 school. There was a historical arrest, and there were several lawsuits, due to this arrest. They brought me in and they said, we're going to do a policy review, a rehash. We want to do an environmental scan, and we want to do a training. We're going to hire you for 6 months. It ended up being a 2-year project because they were very concerned about interactions between the students and the teachers. But in speaking to the parents and interviewing the principals and et cetera, everybody else, I realized, well, there's also stuff going on between the kids. So we ended up creating policies of interactions between teachers and kids, policies of interactions among the kids, investigation policies, intervention policies. We taught the teachers how to report. We brought in the government agency that they will be reporting to lower the barrier and lower the fear. And now they have a whole new set of policies. The teachers are trained. They learned a new language of how to report, because you can't just say something weird's going on. That's not going to raise the alarm. You have to use the words that are very hard sometimes for conservative people of faith, small c, to raise, right? If that's not their language. So that's one example. The other example is a current restorative justice project that I'm working on, where the reform movement said we did wrong and we want to restore and heal the survivors who want to be involved in this project. It is not perfect. It is really hard work, but for the survivors who want this, it is also extremely meaningful. And then finally, yesterday, I just gave a talk with a survivor of abuse, and it was a policy summit, a child safety summit for a national camp all over the United States and Canada. And I said, what if we brought a survivor to ground this policy conversation in the lived experience of a survivor? I also have my own story, so he and I were able to talk about that piece, and it brought to light for those counselors what it looks like if somebody gets abused in your camp versus how do I report and what should I watch out for? This really impacted our lives. So those are just a few examples.
I can go just to echo a lot of what Guila said. What I am really appreciating about what's happening in the Muslim communities, and I use that as plural because there's not one Muslim community, is the storytelling that has emerged since the Me Too movement, the Mos Too movement, right? And like, you know, some of these public cases that have been kind of discussed widely. The storytelling that's emerged has resulted in, you know, experiences that are really healing for survivors themselves, but also really eye-opening for the communities that are sort of bearing witness to that. So by the storytelling, I mean, there's one really fantastic documentary that came out a couple years ago called Breaking Silence. It's on Amazon Prime now. And that follows the story of 3 different South Asian Muslim survivors of sexual assault and their stories of healing and you know, disclosing to their families and moving, you know, in a positive way. Then there's, you know, a lot of art experiences coming up, both like with art therapists and also like theater that is also kind of telling these stories. So I think that is one response, particularly the, you know, the artistic and creative community has kind of used to promote raise awareness about this issue. And then the other thing I'll say is after our case, the case that I mentioned in 2014, that lasted from 2014 to 2016, that sort of like really, you know, kind of awakened a lot of communities and institutions to sort of think about what it looks like to, you know, develop policies, to have staff trainings, to have like a method and mechanism for investigation, right? Like none of this existed like 10, 15 years ago. And now we have, you know, not one, but several organizations that are committed to just looking at this issue and just looking at what does it mean to hold people accountable? What does it mean to, you know, explore restorative justice when, you know, law enforcement is not an option and things like that. And so I would say that. And then for us in particular at Heart, we've developed a 3-tier framework where it's talking about like what you can do at the individual level, what you can do at the community level, and what you can do if you're like in a leadership position at the institutional level. So we have responding with Rahma, which means compassion. So responding with compassion. And this is the framework where we believe literally everyone in this world should know how to respond to disclosure, right? Because a lot of times victims, when they disclose to their loved ones, they disclose to their parents, their teachers, their, you know, friends, their neighbors. And so whether you are a friend or a neighbor, or you are a teacher or a police officer, you should be able to have the skills to respond to them in a way that is grounded in compassion, in a way that's trauma informed, in a way that honors, you know, their cultural and religious context, right? And then in a way that actually gives them the necessary information and referrals that they need to actually seek safety and healing. And then our second framework is for communities who are thinking about prevention, which is fulfilling your amana. And amana is like a God-given trust. It's a God-given responsibility. So we're basically saying that preventing sexual assault and sexual abuse is a responsibility that's endowed on communities to fulfill. So that's a framework too of like, here are the steps that you can take to actually prevent this in your community. And then leading with Adala, which means leading with justice, is the framework for leadership. When something happens on your watch in your actual spiritual space, how do you first and foremost support the victim? And then after that, create an action plan to alert the community, think about what accountability looks like, and all of that in a victim-centered way, right? And so that's like our response to how to do this and raise awareness in the community.
Yeah, those are great. And so again, so much similarity between the different religious traditions that we have here. So for me, a lot of what I see is, again, much of it is reactive, like Guila said, which is fine with me, and part of the reason it's fine is because over the last year, we've already, this time of year, last year, we had less people contacting us. And it's like the more conversations in the media and in churches and in conferences and in academia that happen around sexual abuse within Christian communities and Protestant communities, the more pastors and leaders become aware of it, and the more when something happens, they recognize that they're limited in their knowledge or understanding. And so one of the best things that I see all the time is that church leaders will reach out to an organization like Grace, or to their local child advocacy center, which is something we tell them to, you want to start to build a rapport with them, or to some kind of law enforcement, member of their community that knows information about this, or to a social worker in their community, or the teachers or people who are mandated reporters within their congregation that know about this stuff. They'll reach out. And one of the things for trauma-informed responses is collaboration. And so we're constantly trying to communicate, take a team approach, get different people with different areas of expertise to kind of come together and talk through what the problems are, and then what kind of creative responses can you have to those problems. So that's one thing that we see that's been getting much better, is that more churches, more leaders were reaching out to be more collaborative and to get expertise from outsiders. And what we also do, which is great, we have one of the things we do with Grace is we have a safeguarding initiative, which is kind of like, it's kind of a little bit like what Guila was talking about, where like she worked with the church for 2 years, where sometimes we're doing standalone policies, and that's another thing that's great. Churches will say, we had this instance, and now we have a known offender in the congregation, and our policy doesn't address that. What do we do? And so we help them craft a policy that's going to help shift the culture, that's going to help them know how to hold the abuser accountable, how to evaluate that abuser, whether or not that abuser should even be in the congregation, if it's safe. So there's that kind of thing. They'll just ask for the practical, what do we do policy-wise? But then we also have this initiative where it's kind of like, we're working on policy with them. They put together, at our recommendation, a team of, depending on how large their community is, their congregation is, of 3 to 6 people whose responsibility it is to seek more training, to learn what the best trainings for their culture, their community would be, that are working on creating the policies, that are interacting with Grace. We do building walkthroughs and talk to them about, what are the areas that are more vulnerable that an abuser will see as a place to, that's isolated enough, but close enough to people where they can abuse, but with plausibility that they weren't abusing. So it's practical kind of things like that. And it takes a while. We do the leadership training, we'll do all adult training, and the best responses that we get are when the leaders can effectively communicate to the congregation that this is the responsibility of everyone in the community. It's not the responsibility of the people who do the nursery or the Sunday school or the youth pastors or just the parents. Everyone in the community is responsible to make sure that this is as safe an environment that's possible. And everybody in the community is responsible to begin to do their part in shifting the culture in practical ways. like what what Guila said with, you know, like you'll have policies about how do children interact with each other, how do adults interact with children. So everybody needs to be on board and be trained and educated and begin to practice those behaviors. And then another big important piece is, in order for everybody to take responsibility, the leaders have to educate them and empower them to do so. So we talk to leaders about what does it look like to support your congregation and to empower them to speak up against their own leaders, against you if you're the leader, and feel comfortable doing so. And so that's a key part of kind of the education too, is that, you know, the equity thing. Like, just because there's a leader doesn't mean that they are not held responsible for the same things that everybody else is. And so, but there's a lot of training that goes into that. And so the churches that we've worked with that, you know, have been the most, like, I guess, encouraging, and that I've been super enthusiastic to work with, are the ones where they get, this is for everybody. You know, we're going to teach our toddlers, all touch is welcome. You know, we're going to teach the elders what elder abuse looks like, what disrespect looks like, or, you know, what healthy interactions look like. But everybody's responsible for this. Everybody has a role to play. Yeah, and the best churches, the most exciting churches, understand that concept.
Thank you all so much for those positive examples. It's really good to hear those things. And I'm going to go back and watch this video later and take some notes of my own, because so much of this applies to all the work that we're doing with Awake. So thank you for that. We want to make sure that we make time for audience questions, and we're running like just a little bit behind because you guys have had so many awesome things to share. But before that, I just want to invite you all to just really briefly, if you could, you know, name just maybe one, or if you need to, two briefly, ideas that you would really just want the audience to understand about sexual abuse in faith communities. So kind of big picture, what's something that you really want them to walk away with today? Maureen, do you want to go first since you're unmuted there?
Yeah. So the first thing I would say would be that in my experience, a lot of the justificational responses when there's an abuser who has sexually abused a child or a teen or even another adult, it's talked about with language that is very passive. They fell into sin, they gave in to temptation, they lost control. Like, there are these momentary kind of temptations that they give into. And research tells us that that's not the case. And even if you look at text within the Bible that talk about people who are predatory, that's also not the case. So abusers, predators are very intentional. They make choices, a series of choices, not even just one choice to abuse, but series of choices to abuse, to set victims up, to groom their communities, to groom their victims. And even opportunistic, like abusers that just look for opportunities, have set up the circumstances around their lifestyle so that those opportunities become available to them. There's always intentionality. And so I want people to understand that this is not a mistake or an error or a slip or a fall. This is somebody who is so entitled and out of touch with reality that they believe it is okay for them to harm somebody, you know, for their own benefit. And then the other part of that would be when somebody is abused, there's often a lot of minimization. It doesn't matter if the sexual abuse was non-contact, if it was minimal contact, if it didn't conclude in rape. All sexual abuse is violating and damaging and has great impact. And because God created us holistically, it impacts all of us physically, spiritually, emotionally, psychologically. There's no part of a human being that's not going to be impacted by being violated sexually. And so I want people to understand that it's not just, oh, but that was just 3 minutes of your life, or that was just a few minutes over 10 years. No, this has great impact. And we need to understand that and begin to learn what are the best ways to support and respond to victims and survivors and their loved ones, so that they can relearn how to be in a safe community, how to trust their own perceptions, how to trust God again, because that can be a big piece too. So that would be my takeaway, is it's always intentional and there's always impact.
Thanks, Maureen.
I can add to that, to Maureen's point about, all forms of violence have impact. I also want folks to really be aware of how we live in a culture and a society that actually perpetuates violence, sexual violence every day. And even if we as individuals are not perpetrating that physically, there are things that we might do that we are complicit with that culture. And so, and everyone has a role to disrupt that culture. And so, if you are hanging out with your guys and, there's locker room jokes, like that is violence, that is sexual violence. And that's those are the kinds of attitudes and jokes that lead to the folks who actually perpetrate, right? The folks who actually objectify and groom and prey on their victims. And so it's important to think about not just focusing on the act of the crime or the violence itself, but all the things that led up to it, all the little tiny moments in our society and in our world that lead up to that are equally as important to address if we want to eliminate this from our communities. And then the second thing I'd say, to my point about everyone has a role, and this was something that Maureen mentioned already, it's really important to have everyone think about what role they're going to play, even if it's a small one, in their lifelong commitment to addressing and preventing sexual violence, right? So it's like, do I want to be the safe person that people come to disclose in the community? Do I want to work with institutions to create safer and more inclusive spaces? Do I want to be in leadership where I'm actually having to make hard decisions about, how to create safer spaces, how to hold people accountable, right? There are things that every single one of us can do, even if it's just as simple as believing a survivor when they disclose. And I think it's important for us to lean in those roles.
Yeah. I'm just going to add briefly that I think faith communities need to understand that it is not a survivor's responsibility to make our community safe. And for those who have taken that upon themselves, I am so grateful. We have to be grateful because they are doing it to their detriment often, for our own safeguarding. And it is time to no longer let perpetrators be comfortable in our spaces because of our silence. There are ways, Maureen has talked about it already, of how to help and how to love and how to care using our faith values. But let's take the responsibility upon ourselves. Silence is not a passive thing. It is something that we actively do and create. And so let's ask ourselves, what do we want to allow for? What do we want to show up for? And what do we want to change? And let's do it, not wait for survivors and then later say to them, oh, you can't talk bad about our community. We can't have it both ways.
Oh. Thanks, Guila. I know we're going to turn to at least a few audience questions now, so I'll take things to you, Erin.
Sure. We have probably a dozen great questions from the audience tonight, but I'm just going to focus in on one or two. Nadiah, something that you mentioned raised a question. You mentioned the spiritual abuse by the teacher in the Muslim community, one person that you referred to. Some members in the Awake community have experienced spiritual abuse as well and have asked questions about this. And I wonder if any of our panelists have thoughts on how communities can prevent spiritual abuse in particular.
So I think it's important first to understand what spiritual abuse is, and the ways that we talk about spiritual abuse is there's two sort of ways that spiritual abuse is perpetrated. So one is by a spiritual leader. So a person who has religious authority is either emotionally abusing, financially abusing, or sexually abusing people who are learning from them or following them, right? Then another way that we like to talk about spiritual abuse is, I don't want to necessarily say peer-to-peer, but in everyday relationships where somebody might misuse religious tradition to justify their power and control over their victim. So first and foremost, I think it's important to understand what is actually happening. You know, power and control happens in all situations of abuse, and the weapon that, you know, people use differs depending on, you know, what resonates in that community. And so spiritual abuse is using religion as a weapon to sort of have power and control over someone. So I would say, you know, also understanding that spiritual abuse does not happen in a silo. So oftentimes if spiritual abuse is happening, so is sexual abuse or financial abuse or emotional abuse and all of that. So you can't just prevent spiritual abuse and not prevent the others. So you really have to think about it from a holistic point of view and think about what it means to prevent power-based violence in general. But I'm sure Guila and Maureen have a lot to say about this too.
Thank you for that. Okay. All right. So Guila and Maureen, would you like to add anything else?
Nadiah covered.
Yeah. Okay. Excellent. Excellent. I think
I agree. Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks for that great definition too, Nadiah, of spiritual abuse. Let's go on to another question, which I think is really interesting and was raised by Mike, a member of our audience tonight. He asks, has your faith tradition developed different approaches or strategies for serving male survivors of sexual abuse? Maureen, would you like to share? Or Guila, sorry, go ahead.
I don't know if the Jewish tradition has developed a particular strategy. I would actually say that male survivors of abuse were more recognized in the Jewish tradition for a very long time over women victims, especially in the Orthodox community where there's a lot of gender segregation. So men teach boys and women teach girls, and the genders really don't have a lot of mixing. And so when you would start to say that a woman was abused, or a girl was abused, it was really like, what opportunity would there be, even though we know it happens? So there were actually times where I've been in faith communities. I'm also on the board of the Survivors Network for Those Abused by Priests. And so at conferences there, myself and others would say, like, are we recognized in some of these conversations? And we would feel sometimes, let's sit at our table to talk about what it is to be a woman in a faith community or a girl in a faith community who has been abused. So male survivors are recognized, although there are definitely particular difficulties in coming forward and being a male survivor in faith communities and outside of faith communities. And so while there haven't been strategies developed, I do think they're being recognized. And for example, we're running a conference, the Safety, Respect, Equity Network is having a conference. And I said, we have to ensure that we have people of all genders that have been abused to understand the nuances, not just of the victimization itself, but of the disclosure and the response to those disclosures. So I think just having that awareness and ensuring that we know that each survivor is an expert of their own experiences, not everybody else's experiences.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Guila said. Unfortunately, within the Protestant community, there's a lot of ignorance and denial about the reality of males being sexually abused. There's so much, it's not even just minimization, it's an inability to recognize that abuse is actually abuse. So if a male victim has a male perpetrator, they find it difficult to believe that that even exists. And then if a male victim has a female perpetrator, then it's not looked at as abuse or as having impact in the same way it would be if it was a female victim and an adult male perpetrator. So that's something that we need to work on and talk about more. And we definitely bring up statistics in our training and we talk through some of that stuff to let people know, because I've met a significant number of evangelical Christians that didn't even think it was possible for a boy or a man to be sexually abused. And it's just because there's such a stigma, there's so much shame. And so talking about it more to reduce the shame is one of the tactics that we try to focus on, and educating people more so that they're aware that this occurs. And, it's not that it occurs a little bit, this occurs a lot. And then there's also the bias, again, unfortunately, well, that's a Catholic problem, and it's like, no. Wherever sexual, wherever people are, you're going to have abuse, which means you're going to have sexual abuse, which means you're going to have same-sex abuse and other sex abuse. And but it is something that we're thinking about and trying to figure out how to just move this forward so that boys and men can be safe in their communities, not just safe and free from abuse, but safe in the aftermath to share that they've been abused, to even recognize that they've been abused, and to have a safe community to disclose, because so many children do not disclose. And there's a lot of issues for girls disclosing, but for males, there's a lot of complex cultural issues that keep them from disclosing more than even females. And I think the average male survivor of childhood sexual abuse will often not disclose until they're in their 50s. And that's only the percentage of the ones that disclose at all. So that needs to change. And we're working towards that. That's an excellent question.
Yeah. Thank you, Maureen, for offering that. I'm so conscious of the time and really regret that we can't address more questions because we have some good ones here. But thank you to all of our panelists. I'm just going to now pass the microphone to Catherine Hours, my colleague at Awake, and we will hear from our panelists again, but Catherine has something to share first. Thank you very much.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you to each of our panelists and to our audience members for the questions you posed this evening. Our intention with the Courageous Conversation series is for the conversation to lead us to action. So I'm going to invite our panelists back on screen in just a few moments to share an action step that they recommend. First, I do just want to share some important announcements. Later tonight, I will send you a follow-up email that includes a feedback survey and registration for part 2 of this Courageous Conversation. We hope you'll share your thoughts about tonight, and that you'll join us next Thursday to discuss what you heard this evening. Those small group discussions are always meaningful, and we'd love to have you join us. After part 2 next week, Courageous Conversations will take a break for the summer, and we invite you to stay tuned for details about our 2023-2024 season, which will begin this fall. So now let's turn briefly back to the panelists with this question. What would you recommend that each of us do to help create safety in our particular faith communities? Nadiah, can I begin with you, please?
Yeah, mine's really simple, and that is to commit to believing survivors. Then it's so simple, but it's so critical. And there's a statistic out there that says like somebody discloses 7 times before they're believed. And that's just so damaging and re-traumatizing. So I would say commit to believing survivors and interrogating your biases of why you don't believe survivors.
Thank you. Maureen, what action step would you recommend?
Well, I would say if you are not a survivor and have never been a victim, what you can do for survivors is to become more educated about this, and also to model and practice what it looks like to relate in healthy, boundaried, self-cared ways, because victims need to see that it's okay to take care of themselves, that it's not selfish. And then if you are a victim survivor, again, the same thing, find supportive people who do believe you, and begin to take care of yourself and be kind to yourself. And when other survivors or victims or their loved ones see you doing this, there's a thing about it that invites them to share or to disclose to you, but it also invites them to begin to look at their abuse in a different way and to be able to learn how to value themselves again. So it's just becoming the best versions of ourselves that God created us to be can really help people disclose and become healthier.
Thank you. And last but not least, Guila, what action step do you suggest for us?
So at the 9:30 mark, being mindful of the time, I'm going to say to keep having courage and keep having conversations.
Thank you. Yeah. And again, we give each of y'all our heartfelt thanks for joining us this evening. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So now as we close, the leadership of Awake is motivated by our faith to do this work of listening and learning from survivors. When we gather, we pray together. So we will end tonight with a short prayer, and we invite anyone who wishes to stay to join us in our prayer. We know that there are very good reasons that some may not choose to stay. And if you'd like to sign off now, please know that we wish you peace and goodness, and that we hope to see you again. So now, as we begin our closing prayer, let us remind ourselves that, as always, we are in the presence of a God of many names. Feeling that presence now, we collect ourselves, knowing that listening, as we have done tonight, is an act of love. Thank you, God of many names, for bringing us together this evening and giving us the gift of listening to the wisdom that we have heard tonight. May we hold one another in our hearts, each doing our part to cultivate love, hope, and healing that leaves no one out and no one behind as we continue to build the beloved community. Amen. Thank you all again for joining us this evening, and good night.